Patrick, John, thank you for taking some time to visit with me. I appreciate the efforts that you guys do over at our generation and transmission provider. At our last board meeting, my board asked me to visit with you gentlemen about some questions they had about reliability, where we're looking at what the future looks like for renewables, how does that fit into our energy mix and things like that. So as I think everybody is aware, in Texas this past winter, we saw some extreme weather events that triggered power shortages, problems with the grid, problems with the transmission and generation system, things like that. How is Arizona Electric Power? You guys provide us our power and energy and the transmission for that. How are you positioned to handle a situation similar to that?
Well, I think that's a great question, Steve. Let me provide a little background on Texas, and then we'll get into why we're different. So the Texas market includes about 26 million end-use customers. They have about 46,000 miles of transmission, and they have a 74,000 megawatt peak. That means that's the amount of demand they have on their system. So it's a large market. It's a fairly diverse portfolio that they have in terms of resources, power resources to serve that load. The one caveat is that in the last several years, they've seen coal plants retire and really have replaced a lot of that coal with a lot of wind. There's a lot of wind in Texas, especially out in West Texas. And unfortunately, that wind tended to be fairly vulnerable to the events that occurred in February. What happened in February was a winter weather anomaly. There were record low temperatures in Texas. 73% of the mainland U.S. was covered with snow, and the temperatures were 30 degrees lower than during a normal year, and that really affected Texas. The impact was pretty substantial. So you saw over about a 4 or 5 day period, over 100 hours of continuous rolling blackouts. More than 4 million people were without power. And probably the chief culprit in a lot of that, there are a lot of reasons, but probably the chief culprit was a failure to winterize a lot of the resources in Texas. So the gas plants, and also the wind turbines. And by winterize, there are certain things you can do to make sure those resources operate even in very low temperatures, and those things weren't done. And it's because these sort of events just haven't happened very often. That led to a series of events that just made things worse and worse. So I'm going to turn it over to John to kind of walk through some of the why and how we're different here at Arizona Generation and Transmission Co.
Thanks, Patrick. As Patrick alluded to, the winterization is really key. We put a lot of time and effort back in 2011 when the last real cold weather snap hit southern Arizona here, and we went through to upgrade all the winterization. Our plan. We say winterization. We'll talk about heat tracing on lines, all kinds of testing key equipment to make sure it's going to work during those weather situations. And to tie into what actually happened or what we saw from it, Steve asked the question, how would we be prepared for a similar situation? I was going to say how we reacted to this situation. On the power price side, we saw the price jump about 50 times. So coming into the day, power prices are around $30 a megawatt hour. Just to add some context to your members, Steve, is that 10 cents a kW hour is about $100 a megawatt hour. So prices run about $30 a megawatt hour. They jumped to just under $1,500 a megawatt hour. So about 50-time increase on the power side we saw jumped. And on the gas side, it was running about $2 MMBTU. We saw it jump on that about 100 times, where it went up to about $280 an MMBTU. So what AEPCO had done, instead of buying into the higher price gas,
let me just point out, I'm sorry to interrupt, but So the Texas market impacted Arizona, and that's important to note. It wasn't just something that happened in Texas. What happened was the constraints on the system shot up power costs, just like John mentioned, but it also shot up the natural gas prices because a lot of that was being used, as much as Texas could use, was being drawn back into Texas instead of being exported out of Texas into Arizona, which we usually rely on in order to power up our units at Apache.
Thank you, Patrick.
So that affected prices.
So when we saw that divergence between the gas and the power prices, instead of just buying that gas that we said went up 100 times, AEPCO actually backed off on our gas generation and increased our coal generation. So, for instance, our coal, we have over a 30-day stockpile on the ground, and it isn't susceptible to these price spikes as you see in the natural gas side. So we increased our coal generation to the point that we're running it around the clock for this whole 7-day period. And we backed down the gas unit to minimum, and in some cases even took the gas unit off, bought a little bit of power on the market. So, Steve, that's one of the ways that AEPCO in this situation helped Duncan Valley avoid some of this really high-priced power in this situation.
Right, and I think the key here is that having a diverse portfolio is really where you want to be. We've got a lot of natural gas assets, and generally those work very well, but in a situation where the natural gas prices are spiking, you also want to be able to turn to your coal because you've got coal on the ground. And the coal on the ground reflects a very steady price. Coal costs have been very similar for the last 20 years, and that helps to hedge a position. You know, when the coal's on the ground, you can use it, even during a 3 or 4 or 5 day outage. The other thing that I just want to mention is that we have, over the last 10 years or so, we've developed a lot of transmission paths to different markets. So even if one market is going through sort of emergency conditions, there is the possibility that we can turn to a different market, say in California or even north into the Pacific Northwest, to find power and bring it back home. And that can also be a hedge against local disturbances or cost increases.
And then, Steve, one thing to add to your members, this operational plan and flexibility saved somewhere between $10 and $20 million just during this 5 to 7 day situation in Texas.
That's right. There were utilities in Arizona that were more dependent on a particular fuel, natural gas, that got hit very hard. And thankfully, we were able to avoid that.
Well, thank you. You know, as you talked about some of their energy mix and the reliance on wind and things like that, made me think about last summer in California. Many of their customers were left out. They were in the dark. They were experiencing the same thing, same types of rolling blackouts. Is California, or did they move too quick? Are they over reliant on just renewables? Are they not backed up? What do we do to make sure we're not in that situation?
And that's another great question. It's funny how these two things are sort of bookends. California, similar to Texas, very large market, 32 million end-use customers, 26,000 miles of transmission, 50,000 plus megawatt peak. They do have a different resource portfolio. They do not have a lot of nuclear or coal. In fact, they have no coal, virtually no coal left. They are very much tilted towards the renewable side. They do still have natural gas generation. So what happened in California was, instead of it being very cold, it got very hot during the summer last year. It was a regional widespread heat anomaly. The record temperatures were up in Death Valley above 130 degrees, and we were at drought conditions, so there were a lot of water pumps going as well. It was really sort of a perfect storm. And the reason it matters that it was regional is that if it was just happening in California, then they could look to their partners in other states to buy power. But in fact, what was happening was this was widespread. So people in Arizona and Nevada and other states who were also experiencing this heat anomaly, they didn't have the power to sell California something that they have relied on more and more over time as they have increased their renewable portfolio. A lot of people in California may not know that, but essentially they're leaning on other states to sort of fill in the gaps when they have large increases in loads. And when their portfolio, their renewable portfolio, is not performing the way they expect. So yes, there is an impact on relying so much on renewable power without having in-state or local backup that is available to dispatch when the renewable power is not online. We can't always predict when the renewable power is going to be online. That's why there's a move to batteries, but even batteries have limitations. A natural gas plant can be dispatched at any time as long as you have a ready supply of natural gas. So I'll also turn this over to John to talk about some of the details there.
Yeah, so a couple of things that we did prior to last summer we came into is we have what's called a load shed procedure, essentially, which what we do is we look at all of our members' loads, all of their resources, and ensure that they have enough resources to meet the summer peak demand. So we did that coming into the summertime, and we really try to have a mix of AEPCO member-owned resources as well as a small amount of imports from other areas. Now, we try to rely a lot less on those imports from other areas. Like Patrick said, in the California ISO example, they were relying a lot heavier on imports. Somewhere as up as 10 to 15% of their power was coming from outside the state of California. So when you rely on other markets essentially to cover your need, now you're susceptible to when those markets have high weather like we saw, that those power is not going to be there. So combine that in California with the renewables as it got to that time in the evening when the sun was dropping off, so the solar didn't have the output. It's just a perfect storm when they didn't have enough power. And Steve, you talk about some of the rolling blackouts and stuff that we had in California. We did, AEPCO as a whole did avoid all of that through our membership. One, I want to give a shout out to Duncan Valley and all of our other members. We did a voluntary type load curtailment conservation effort with the members, and it equated to 5 to 8% of our peak demand that we got to
so what John is saying is we asked people to voluntarily decrease their usage of electricity during a certain period when normally it would be much higher. And because of our amazing members throughout our service territories, our distribution co-op service territories, they responded. They reduced the amount of load that we otherwise would have had to have served, and that would have been served with very expensive power. So that helped us reduce costs.
Yep. And one thing I'd add to that is that we had a meeting with some of the investor-owned utilities in the state after this happened. They did the same type of voluntary reduction. They hit maybe 1 or 2%, a maximum of their peak. We were 5 to 8% of our peak. So our members really did step up when we needed them last summer. Another thing, as Patrick has said before, really diversification of your resource portfolio. That is so key in all these situations. As Steve alluded to, renewables are coming. There's going to be a transition into them. You just got to have a controlled transition so that you just don't want to over rely on your system on any one source.
That's right, and that was part of the problem in California. And the way they sort of hide it is by buying when they need it from other states. And that in this case, during that anomaly, that just wasn't available to them.
And then one thing to wrap up on last summer, Steve, is that with running our resource fleet at Apache, relying on our coal units and some of our natural gas, save our members somewhere between $20 and $30 million of avoided cost if we would have had to go buy that power on the market. And just to look into this summer, power pricing this summer is inflated even more, probably 3 to 5 times what we saw last summer. So that diversification will really pay off last summer, and it'll do the same thing this summer.
And it's an important indicator that we need to be looking at new resources going forward so we continue to have a diverse fleet and that one that can respond in a variety of circumstances.
Well, thank you. I I appreciate that early every year in the spring, we sit down and we talk about our summer resource load and what those needs are. And I'm grateful that we have a power supplier that has our backs, that we partner with, and we have those discussions on a regular basis. You talked quite a bit about some of our energy mix and talking about renewables. What does the horizon look like? Where do we go from here, especially with the push we're seeing from the public and in the government sector of moving towards more renewables? What does that look like for our future? You talked about battery storage, some diversity. What does that look like for us?
And I think that's an important question, and it's probably on the minds of a lot of your members. I think it's certainly something that's going to be gaining importance in Washington with the new administration. I think at the outset, it's important to say this, that utilities and different populations in different places across the country are different. And so what we're hoping to see are flexible rules, rules that acknowledge that in some areas you can move pretty quickly to change resources. In other areas, it's important that you allow that transition to take a little more time in order not to disproportionately impact people that are maybe more spread out, maybe people that don't have as many resources. I will say that a lot of people are surprised when they see the pace of change here at AEPCO, at Arizona G&Ts. They assume because we continue to operate one coal unit that maybe we are not moving in the right direction, but in fact we are. And we're going to put up a couple of slides that are going to show the changes that have occurred. What you'll see is an expansion of the amount of solar that is being utilized by AEPCO and its members. You'll see a transition from coal over to natural gas. We still operate one unit, but you really have seen a much bigger role for natural gas at Apache as we dispatch our gas units much more. The price of natural gas generally, except for these price spikes that we've just pointed out, has remained low. Natural gas is a much lower emitting fuel, so our emissions on all of our measurable emission standards have decreased substantially. And our carbon footprint has also decreased quite a bit. So you're going to see that on these slides, and you'll see that we are in fact making considerable progress. With respect to the future of renewables, I can tell you that both our members individually as well as AEPCO are always engaged in looking at opportunities to participate in or to develop utility scale projects. I know there are a number of standards that our members have to comply with, and we are always working with our members, particularly our all requirements members like Duncan Valley, to make sure that you comply with those standards in a way that is least cost and most optimal for your members.
One thing I would add, Steve, is I wanted to thank you and your membership for your participation in Apache Solar. Duncan Valley stepped up for a larger percentage than most of the other members, and I think it shows a commitment to renewables on your side. It really goes to the fact we said before that renewables make sense as long as you control the amount you come in and augment it with other resources that make sense. I wanted to thank you and your membership for that.
Well, thank you. Several years ago when we started working on this project and Duncan Valley committed to such a large percentage, we felt that we'd done the research. We felt that we weren't doing it at an expense that was outrageous. We saw a number of other projects that we evaluated that the prices were very high. Recently I had a few visits with our Arizona Corporation Commissioners, and we talked about how here at Duncan Valley, we're sitting at more than 25% of our portfolio comes from renewable, the highest of any utility in the state. And part of that is not because we have such a large footprint. In fact, we have the smallest footprint, but because we can partner with our cooperative partners, the other co-ops in the state, we can have a great impact for our members in the terms of renewables, yet still make electricity affordable. So I commend you and thank you for work on that. What about battery storage? What does that look like? We hear a lot of that in the news. What does that look like?
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into that topic, because I do think that's becoming more important. One thing I want to mention, then I'm going to turn it over to John, because John and his team are working on some battery projects right now. But we have already put together a solar battery project for one of our all requirements members, ANZA, which is also a small co-op like Duncan. We put together a project called Sun ANZA. It's a second phase project. It's in California. It helps them to comply not just with our normal sort of renewable standards, but they're also subject to these carbon reduction standards in California, which are fairly unique there. They may be part of the future of all utilities in different states or maybe nationally, but it does help them comply with a variety of standards. So our sister company, Sierra Southwest Cooperative, put together an additional solar facility. I think it was 1.5 megawatts. That's in addition to the 2 megawatts that they have near their headquarters. We also installed batteries and a microgrid, and that microgrid is basically a configuration that allows ANZA to identify really important circuits to make sure that crucial, important public services stay on in any kind of emergency conditions, and it allows them to deploy their batteries in ways that are optimal for ANZA. That has brought their renewable footprint up to pretty similar to Duncan at about 28%. And I think what we're looking at now are some projects, and I'll have John sort of talk those through, that might be beneficial to all of our members, including Duncan Valley.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. So what we're doing, as Patrick mentioned, our sister co-op, Sierra Southwest, we're developing a request for proposal to go out on the streets and get some battery pricing. So as we said before, you got to get the right balance of solar, batteries, combination. So with our Apache Solar resource, we're looking into should we retrofit that with a battery to take advantage of some of the benefits you could get there? Or are we going to look for a standalone battery? When we say standalone battery, that's a sense of batteries you get charged from the power grid or from the system. Not to get too far in the weeds here, but that does allow you to do other things. It allows you to hit a double peak on a cloudy day like Patrick talks about. It allows you to still charge the battery. You still have that output that you need to meet your demand, and you're not totally tied to the solar aspect of it. There's regulation we can use at it to kind of meet the intermittency of the solar. So there's a lot of benefits coming from with a standalone solar or a standalone or a retrofit battery storage project. Another thing that we're looking at a little farther down the road this fall, we're going to go out and start looking if we can develop a joint project with our cooperatives, Duncan Valley and Graham County, as well as some of the other municipalities in the Safford area, to see if we can put a solar battery project into the Gila Valley, essentially like we did with Apache Solar. We get the economies of scale, and it comes in at a price point that makes sense for Duncan Valley and others.
Yeah, and it's that participant-based approach that allows members to determine what amount do they need, and it's entirely based on their needs, not based on what somebody else is telling you need. That I think is a successful approach to these kinds of projects. And so we'll be looking at that to develop options. Our perspective is we always want to be developing options. We want to give our members as much flexibility as possible. And we'll follow that approach with respect to the battery projects that we're looking at right now.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time today. Appreciate your responses. I think for myself and my board, it'll help us feel a lot more comfortable with our power supply and the reliability that our members look forward to, and also the price point. I think that's something that's critical for us, is that we continue to have a price that's affordable to our members, and along with that reliability. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.